right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our craft lecture. My name is Roxane Gay. I'm an assistant professor of English and a coordinator for the annual Zora Neale Hurston online conference. It's my distinct pleasure today to welcome and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Roxane Gay. Dr. Gay wears many hats. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's a cultural critic. She is an editor and professor whose work has shaped contemporary conversations about feminism, about race, power, and representation. Many of her students know her as the author of Hunger, a memoir of my body. Her other acclaimed works include Bad Feminists, Difficult Women, and IET. She's also the author of World of Wakanda for Marvel, the editor of the Best American Short Stories 2018, and a writer of the newsletter The Audacity. Her writing is characterized by empathy, by humor, by candor, and a very fearless engagement with the complexities of the human experience. Now, this is a very condensed introduction to Dr. Gay, which really doesn't do justice to her many contributions and her accomplishments. And after all, she's the person who wrote, I am therefore a bad feminist. I'd rather be a bad feminist than no feminist at all. But Roxane, we are very honored to welcome you to the Zora Neale Hurston conference. You know, in an in-person theater, we'd be clapping loud and hard for you, but we're rather limited by the format. I now hand things over to my co-moderator, Professor Corliss.
Thank you, Dr. Gohai, and welcome, Dr. Gay. I'm also a member of the English department at Bethune-Cookman and part of this year's conference committee. My students and I have certainly been enriched by reading and discussing Dr. Gay's memoir, Hunger, this semester, and some of the essays from Bad Feminist. This presentation, as Dr. Gohai mentioned, is known as our craft lecture. And the focus is on the artistic process, and it's always a less formal format and style. So while we ask you to mute your microphones now, we encourage you to use the chat box going along for comments that you have for Dr. Gay and questions that you think of. And after she's finished speaking, however, we'll invite you to unmute your microphones and ask her questions directly. And I'm sure she'll be happy to field some questions. So now, Dr. Gay, this virtual space is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Corliss. I appreciate it. And hello to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here virtually with you. I am speaking to you from Los Angeles, California, where we get to enjoy, for the most part, it's 80-degree weather, but it's very cold today. It's 60. And so we're tolerating it as best we can. But it is a pleasure to be here because oftentimes I'm invited to talk about craft, and craft can mean a lot of different things to people. In many ways, craft is really the how. How do we do the work that we do? But I firmly believe that craft is also informed by why we do the work that we do. And given the current state of the world, a lot of us are questioning not only the why, but the how, and how do we do this while surviving? And so I'm just going to talk for a little while, and I find that these things are much more effective when we have a conversation. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and I actually have some questions for you as well. You know, oftentimes when I do conversations like these, the organizers will offer a land acknowledgement as a gesture for the atonement of sins for which we know there is no sufficient recompense other than undoing those sins, returning the stolen lands that we all live and work upon, and doing everything in our power to make sure that those lands are never taken again. And clearly there's a grave need for this. Our history has shaped our present, and when we lose sight of it, we choose to forget. We often soften the ground for atrocities to happen over and over and over again. The American president, for example, speaks really cavalierly about colonizing Greenland and Canada and God knows where else. And when he does this, he sounds like a madman, but he's really quite serious. And far too many people, far too many writers are treating these deranged ambitions as legitimate, or they treat them as fodder for humor. But there's nothing that's actually funny about colonial transgression. There's nothing funny about these very abnormal, aberrant circumstances in which we find ourselves. And so we are yoked with a terrible burden of figuring out, how do we respond to the current moment? How do we resist? How do we fight? And as writers, we have to ask ourselves, What is the work of the writer when the world is falling apart and maybe when we are falling apart too? Normally, I start these kinds of conversations with some funny anecdotes, some stories. I put the audience at ease. Maybe I put myself at ease because I hate public speaking. And I have a lot of funny stories because I must tell you, I am very, very funny. And I love sharing funny stories. But I think, like many people, I'm struggling. I'm overwhelmed. Every hour of every single day, we are bombarded by truly horrible news. And just when you think the news cannot get more horrible, it surprises us and says, oh, no, no, we have worse here. And we are seeing this country and the institutions that serve its populace being dismantled with ruthless efficiency by a figurehead president, a drug-addled billionaire, and all manner of just Christo-fascist sycophants and village idiots. And I want to write about it. I want to say something, but I hardly know where to begin. My writing feels so insignificant in the face of brutal authoritarianism right here and right now. In practice, not in theory. But despite this overwhelm, I do know that the work of the writer is not to stay silent, not to surrender, and not to despair. And so, one of the key ways that I try to fight despair is by telling stories. So, I'm just going to tell you a few stories about writing and scholarship and finding an audience and resisting silence. Many years ago, I attended my first academic conference during my fourth year as a PhD student. I was presenting a paper, and at a reception, a well-known scholar in my field, which theoretically is rhetoric and technical communication, asked why I hadn't previously attended the conference, and I told him the truth. I said I didn't have anything to say yet. He paused and he looked really thoughtful, and he said, well, when you go on the job market and you're asked that question, give them that exact answer. I had, it seemed, passed a test. And in the years between then and now, I have discovered that I do actually have quite a lot to say, but I only say it when it feels like the time is right. Every time we look around, we know that we are living in a strange world. And these are very strange times. And as a writer, I'm always thinking about the best ways to write my way into a strange world during the strange time and actually make myself heard. It's very easy in some ways for all of us to express ourselves. We have social media and a bewildering range of online forums to talk about a bewildering range of topics. We have publishing platforms like Medium and WordPress and the various newsletter offerings, though there's no shortage of venues for putting ideas into the world. But having access and having audience are two very different things. When I go to academic conferences, I generally find it really stressful. There's so much posturing, and there are people preening and trying to prove themselves worthy of what, really? Recognition from our peers, the attention of potential employers, opportunities for publishing our work. I often wonder if it's worth it. I'm actually pretty shy in person, so in general, at most real world conferences, I wander around clutching my phone so that I can always look like I'm receiving a very important email at exactly the time that someone looks like they might want to speak to me. But at the first conference I attended that I mentioned earlier, I gave a presentation. I can't even remember what I was talking about, but I was pretty proud of my paper, as most graduate students are want to be. And there were like 20 or so people in the audience, which is to say it was very well attended. In that paper, I said something mildly critical about a prominent scholar's work, in a relevant context, of course. And during the Q&A, a man stood up, cleared his throat, and introduced himself as that prominent scholar. Oh, how I wished in that moment for the ground to open up and swallow me whole. It was fine in the end. I was appropriately humbled. And later that evening, I nursed my humiliation at the hotel bar where I finally understood why people actually go to conferences, and it's to drink a lot. But that presentation experience was a valuable lesson. It reminded me that we are never writing into a silent and yawning void. We are writing for ourselves, hopefully. But when we put our work into the world, we are writing to and for an audience that is going to engage with that work, often in unexpected ways. And that is if we can actually reach an audience, and there's never any guarantee of that. To think about writing, we have to remember that does not happen in a void. We actually live in the world. And over the past several years, I have found myself thinking over and over again about January 6, 2021. At the time, my parents were visiting me here in Los Angeles in the home I share with my wife, Debbie. And we spend a lot of time with my family, so their presence was not exceptional, even though the events of that day were. We were all watching CNN and we were in shock as the insurrection sort of unfolded and then got worse and worse and worse. We saw this mob of angry white men and, of course, a few angry white women and a few assorted others invading the Capitol building, intent on keeping Congress from certifying the election results, which they disagreed with. It was chaotic, it was bizarre. It was so antithetical to what we've long been told are American democratic values, a tantrum for all of the world to see. In some ways, the mob swarming the Capitol seemed well coordinated, but then there were moments when it was clear that this was not, for most of the participants, a particularly well thought out endeavor. They wandered through the building, they waved flags, they caused mayhem, they made threats, they vandalized congressional offices in very unimaginative ways. They tore and they tore and they tore at the long fraying fabric of democracy, and they did so gleefully. Many of the mob crowed about what they were doing on social media. They were proud. They wanted everyone to know that they were part of this fateful event. At the time, I was disgusted by what I saw, but it felt inevitable in many ways. An attempted insurrection was the only possible outcome after years of a politician bending reality for millions and millions of Americans to fit his narrow and profoundly ignorant worldview and, of course, his many bigotries. This was the inevitable outcome of naming anything that conflicts with that worldview fake news. It was the inevitable outcome of a politics of grievance. And this was all but part of the price that we are all destined to pay for one black president out of 46. But what I remember most about that day was my father, who spent most of his early life in Haiti, living under the Duvalier regime. Francois Duvalier, or Papa Doc, was the president of Haiti for 24 years. He was an autocrat through and through, ruling the country through force. He had a secret police force called the Tonton Macoute, who did Papa Doc's evil bidding and helped him hold on to power through corruption, torture, sexual violence, and murder, all of the old hate favorites. He made changes to the Haitian constitution to consolidate his power, going so far as to name himself president for life. When he died in 1971, his son Jean-Claude, who was only 19, became president and would continue his father's authoritarian work, continue to wield the Tonton Macoute as his personal death squad, and rob the country blind so he could live lavishly while ignoring the abject poverty of the very people he meant to lead. My father, who was born in 1946, knows intimately about the ills of authoritarianism and unchecked political power. He knows about people being disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night or in broad daylight. He knows about journalists and writers and artists being silenced and forced underground. He knows what it means to live in fear, to be surrounded by corruption and desperation. And what chilled him on January 6th was seeing that all of those things that he knows so intimately were playing out here in this country that always frames itself as an exceptional paragon of democracy. But this is the United States, he kept saying over and over as he rubbed his stubbled chin. I can't believe this is happening. I will never forget the look on his face, both haunted and horrified. It was the look of someone who was looking at this country's future through the lens of his country's past. In the many years, 5 in fact, since the January 6th insurrection, this democracy has degraded further. The country for many of us is unrecognizable, but for some of us who have long felt this country's wrath, this is the country we've seen all along, and everyone else is finally welcomed into our reality. And many of the realities that we assumed only happened in other countries are happening right here, right now. Now, when I'm out in the world, I often see Black Lives Matter signs. I see them on people's front lawns. I've seen it spray painted on a highway overpass. I see little placards in the display windows of businesses. Sometimes the signs are large. Sometimes they're no bigger than a piece of notebook paper tucked into the bottom corner of a window. I would like to believe that these declarations matter, that they make a difference. I would like to believe that they are well-intended and sincere. And I have no doubt that sometimes they are. I also have no doubt that sometimes they are cynical and they're meant to convey what a business thinks their customers want to see, an awareness of the world's problems and the tensions of modern times. It has been several years, of course, since police murdered George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. In the interim, there have been countless more deaths. In the immediate aftermath, corporations said all the right things, and they pledged around $50 billion to vaguely defined diversity initiatives, most of which would ultimately benefit those same corporations. Around 70 million of those $50 billion went directly to organizations doing social justice work and criminal justice reform, and only 4.2 billion of that money was in the form of actual grants, with a range of payment terms from immediate to distributed over 10 years. This is to say that what we say and what we mean and what we do are three different things. The corporation said Black Lives Matter. They meant we recognize people are suffering and angry, and while we don't really care, we are fine with doing the bare minimum to acknowledge that maybe Black Lives Matter. And then what they did was very little, if anything at all. And I think as writers, that's something that we should never forget, because what we say, what we mean, and what we do are always going to be three different things. And when we're lucky, they are in fact aligned. I've been very outspoken over the course of my career. I've also been very fortunate to have the ability to be very outspoken. I've written essays about race, gender, sexuality, class, identity, and politics, sexual violence, and once in a while, I even get to write about joyful, less complicated matters like reality TV and the Fast and Furious franchise, which is also known as the best movies ever. A lot of my work is provocative, or at least that's what people who are invested in the status quo think. I'm pretty sure the notions that women are people or Black Lives Matter or all bodies of all abilities matter, that detaining children in cages is wrong, that ICE should be abolished, and that trans rights are civil rights are not particularly provocative, but here we are. And in this political climate, there's simply no telling what will provoke people in power and why. What's even more challenging is that the people in power are so easily provoked. If you provoke this administration, and let's say you are on a valid visa or are a naturalized citizen instead of a birthright citizen, you might be disappeared. You might have your visa taken away. People are accused of aiding and abetting terrorists. We saw this when people were protesting the genocide in Gaza. A Columbia graduate student, Mahmoud Khalil, was taken away from his family for exercising his legal right to protest an unambiguous atrocity. Yoon Chung, also a Columbia University student, was almost arrested and deported, and of course is now suing the Trump administration. She's a naturalized citizen. She dared to protest, she dared to provoke, and she paid the price. We have seen this over and over and over again, that there are consequences for the ways in which we use our voice, and sometimes those consequences are far-reaching. Who I am today as a writer began with a broken heart. On Valentine's Day in 2004, the woman I was in a relationship with, that we didn't really call a relationship, sent me an email ending things once and for all. I was devastated, and I wanted nothing more than to get as far away from Lincoln, Nebraska, where I was living at the time, as I could. As luck would have it, I was manning a table the following month at the annual National Society of Black Engineers conference. Eager young engineering students were walking around talking to university representatives about their programs, and those representatives promised all of these young engineers a bright and lucrative future. At the time, my future was neither bright nor lucrative. I was a communications specialist for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln College of Engineering, which is a mouthful, and it was a pretty good job. I got to write for the alumni magazine and advise a student publication and create recruitment materials that did not tell the truth about the campus because there were lots of people of color in there and maybe like three actual Black engineering students. I did have a great boss who taught me a great deal about writing, but then I got dumped and I wanted something different. I sat at my table at that conference, arranging and rearranging stacks of brochures advertising chemical engineering and agricultural and mechanical engineering and all of the other programs. I half-heartedly answered questions that were all a variation on how much money can I make with an engineering degree, and the answer was always more than I will ever make. Across the aisle from me was this woman representing Michigan Technological University. And during lulls in the conference, we got to talking, and before long, she convinced me to apply to a PhD program in rhetoric and tech comm at her university. I knew nothing about that field, and I knew nothing about Michigan Tech, but I did want to run away. So in June, I received my acceptance and a financial aid package. In August, my brother and I drove to Houghton, Michigan, and I realized that I probably should have put a little more thought into where I wanted to run away to. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Houghton, Michigan is a deeply rural place, nearly 10 hours north of Detroit, in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It's a densely forested area on the shores of Lake Superior, and it is one of the most desolate but beautiful places that I've ever been to. The summers are short and the winters are long. The place gets more than 300 inches of snow a year, and the locals are very proud of this. There's an Ojibwe reservation nearby, but other than that, there are few people of color to be found and no black people. The roads are long and narrow and they wind through the trees. Deer hover at the shoulders, often running across the two-lane highways when you least expect it. Industrial ruins from abandoned copper mines dot the landscape. In Hancock, the adjacent town where I lived, all the street signs are in both English and Finnish because Hancock, I'll have you know, boasts the highest concentration of Finnish people outside of Finland, or at least that's what I was told almost every single day for 5 years. There wasn't much to do, especially because I'm not much of an outdoors person, and in the Upper Peninsula, the outdoors is quite frankly all there is. But graduate school quickly consumed my life, and I began teaching for the first time, which was nerve-wracking. I was doing my coursework and learning an entirely new field, and I was starting to think about my research. Because there was little else to do, I wrote during my free time short stories, blog posts, essays, a couple of really bad poems. And with each new piece, I became a stronger writer. I consulted the internet when I wanted to submit my work or learn how to write in a new genre or find an agent. I received so many rejections that I started to wonder if I would ever find any measure of success as a writer. In fact, I started a blog called I Have Become Accustomed to Rejection, and I would lovingly detail every single rejection I received and how I felt about it. Highly recommend. I considered giving up. I tried giving up, and then I wrote even more. I had been published in the years before my doctoral program, but it was during these years that I unapologetically took myself seriously. I put in the proverbial work, even though when there was absolutely no payoff, it didn't matter. I did it anyway. There was no magic to it, though there was, of course, some luck, and I worked hard enough to be able to take advantage of that luck. With my friend Matt Siegel, we built a magazine that we were very proud of, a true labor of love. We published all kinds of brilliant, strange, sometimes dark and haunting work. We interviewed writers. We had a blog. We published a beautiful print version twice a year and tried to sell a few copies at a book fair every year. And during those years, what I learned most is that the work of a writer is to be relentless and to write and write and write. We lose sight of that sometimes. Social media is great, and then it's terrible. You're connected to so many other writers, and yes, there is fellowship and fun, but if you spend too much time online, it makes you covetous. It makes you bitter. It makes you forget that writing isn't what people talk about online. That's only the great stuff. The residencies and the conferences and the book deals that I promise you aren't your book deals. You aren't seeing the real work of a writer. You're just seeing the after effect. You're not seeing the hours of staring at a blank screen. You're not seeing the wrestling with how to make a plot line work. You're not seeing the search for the right words to express, the reading, of course, the reading, the reading. You're not seeing any of the scribbling of notes in the middle of the night and then trying to decipher what you meant the next morning. You're not seeing the research about some small little fact and getting lost in details that won't ever find their way into your work, but still will inform it and matter anyway. You're not hearing a lot about the endless rejections and the editor of a magazine you're dying to publish in who tells you to maybe wait a few more days between submissions after you receive his rejections, which is a true story. You don't hear about the books with disappointing sales that fall through the cracks despite all the work you put into them. You don't hear about the critical reviews that you memorize particularly stinging lines from and start to doubt yourself and wonder if you're really as terrible as the reviewer suggests. But these things happen to every writer. It's part of the work. This work of recognizing that writing isn't always easy and failure happens more than success, and sometimes it's incredibly lonely, but you do it anyway. You write and you write and you write, especially in these dark and unusual times that we're living in. I've spent most of my academic career at state schools where funding was generally precarious and fickle because state legislatures make decisions about what we should and should not value in education. As an English professor, it was rare that my work felt valued, but I did always recognize that these institutions were supported by taxpayers and that our work should be scrutable to these taxpayers. Writing for the public was a deliberate decision because I don't think that our intellectual work should be walled off from the people in the communities where we not only work but live, and the communities who, in part, support our professional lives. I've had the privilege of being outspoken because of academic freedom. I started on the tenure track and then I was tenured, and though I have worked at fairly conservative universities, I've had supportive department chairs and deans. Without academic freedom, I would have lost my job many times over. Not because I said anything terrible, but because we live in a reactionary world where universities treat everyone but the people who teach in them like customers who are always right. And right now, we're seeing in many states academic freedom being dismantled systematically and deliberately. This is, of course, censorship. It is silencing. And the people who are primarily being silenced are Black people and other faculty of color, women, and people from other underrepresented groups. There is a lot more at stake now when we try to put our work into the world, and those stakes shift from one state line to the next. This is, of course, nothing new. People who challenge the status quo by virtue of their mere existence have always been censored, including this conference's namesake, Zora Neale Hurston. When I read the Paris Review interviews, I'm always marveling at how richly detailed, perfectly composed, and didactic they are. And one common theme in most of the interviews is that nearly every significant writer takes themselves seriously. They have different philosophies and approaches to writing. They have different processes. They are mostly humble, sometimes self-deprecating, but they always detail in some form or fashion the level of work they put into their writing and the work that they put into conceiving their writing. They articulate their influences and how those influences are reflected in their work. They don't provide pithy answers about happenstance or treat writing as some casual affair. They don't say what a lot of young people like to say, which is like, I published a thing, and dismiss all of the effort that went into that work. And I respect that willingness to say, my art is not accidental. I appreciate the willingness to acknowledge that their practice demands effort. When I have time after reading one of these written interviews, I tend to reflect on how elaborate some of their writing processes are, waking up at some ungodly hour, sitting at an austere desk facing west or some such, and then typing on a typewriter for 6 hours before lunch, or scratching out words by hand to transcribe later, or making sure the right books are on your desk at the right angles just in case you need them for reference. I always think, my goodness, I must not be a real writer because I don't have any of that going on. When I write, I generally sit at my couch with a laptop in front of the TV and do my thing. I start at the beginning and I write my way to the end. And then I feel like maybe I'm doing all of this wrong because I don't have 100 different fancy practices to generate writing. I just sit and I stare at the screen. I watch a lot of television, mostly trash, and of course marathons of Law and Order SVU or Criminal Minds because nothing helps you motivate to the page like crime. I type a sentence or two, I delete what I typed, I try again, I move some words around, I refresh my email countless times an hour. It's truly obscene how often I look at my email, even when I'm not expecting any. I have a folder on my hard drive where I keep a ridiculous number of documents, and I've done this for decades. Some of them have 2 or 3 lines I dashed off thinking, this is going to be great, or I want this to be the opening of a story. Others are stories I've made a lot of progress on, but have somehow stalled because I've written myself into a corner that I need to work my way out of. A great many are just empty documents with a title because more often than not, I actually start out with a title and then the work follows. I have a Word file I have kept alive in the virtual sense since 1996. And so when I cut something from a piece I'm working on, I drop it into this never-ending story and I call it I Still Love You because I don't want those words to feel abandoned. When I want to write, but I'm not working on anything specific, I'll often browse through these documents and especially my I Still Love You file to find something that maybe I feel like writing. This can take a very long time because I have to check email one more time because someone maybe is up and very late and they want to talk to me. They never ever do. Finally, very late at night, when there's no more internet to exhaust, I might actually start to do the work of writing. And let me tell you, it is hard to write a book or much of anything when your writing process is so immature and so grounded in procrastination. But I should also be clear that writing is, for the most part, a joyful endeavor. I'm not procrastinating because writing is painful. I'm procrastinating because I'm good at procrastination and lacking in self-discipline. This is also not to say that there's no craft in my work. My writing is all craft. I've been well trained. I have degrees in creative writing and rhetoric and technical communication, but sometimes I don't know how to explain the why of my work. I don't know that I want to explain the why of my writing. Sometimes, as creative people, we need to believe muses exist because we need this tangible way of explaining how we come up with our ideas. I can look at my work and identify a moment or a snippet of a conversation or a person I saw who inspired or as inspired a given story or essay. But I have a much harder time identifying how I assembled an entire story or essay. I don't have a muse, but clearly something is at work, some driving creative force. And it can't necessarily be taught, it can't be bought or sold, but if you're lucky as a writer, it's there quietly fueling your writing practice. If there's anything formal about my writing process, it's that I spend a lot of time thinking about what I want to say. I draft in my head endlessly, and I'm generally able to remember what I've been imagining when I sit at my computer. I have a lot of notes that I email to myself or leave in the Notes app on my phone. I do a lot of research on whatever I'm writing about, and I let that information simmer until I figure out how to best use it. I try not to belabor my work. I'm not the kind of writer who has 11 drafts of a piece sitting on my computer because my process is so much more mental than physical. When I finish a piece, I do read it aloud to hear if it works, to see if I'm being too wordy or repetitive, to suss out if I'm making sense and telling a cohesive story. I revise and I revise a little more, and that's that. I should probably feel guilty about this too, given that so much common wisdom about writing worships at the altar of revision, but I just don't. I take the work of being a writer seriously, but not too seriously, and that feels like the right balance. One second. Nearly every time I publish an opinion essay in the New York Times, an angry man or three, or sometimes a woman, has reached out to my university to complain or to fret over my undue liberal influence over tender young students, or, true story, to complain that he can no longer talk to me because I blocked him on Twitter. That last guy called my department chair regularly. He called the dean and the university president. He lived 50 miles away from my home at the time, and it was in truth terrifying because on his Twitter page, back when we called whatever this place is now Twitter, his banner photo was that of an AR-15 rifle. And I'm one of the lucky ones. Through all of this, I kept my job, I wrote more. When I got tenure, I let loose what I was holding back because tenure is never guaranteed for Black women, and I didn't want to rock the boat too much until I could. When I talk to scholars, they often ask how they can break into writing for a popular audience, as if I might hold the keys to that kingdom. I don't. But what I do have experience with is practice. Scholars want to do public-facing writing for all kinds of reasons, to have their work actually read, to make their work accessible to multiple publics, to diversify their intellectual projects, to change the world, and of course, wealth and fame. As we all know, nothing leads to riches faster than writing about things like Black feminism. I do try to offer the best advice I can, but one of the key requirements when you're writing for an audience is freedom. And to write for the public, you need to know you're going to be shielded from the public when they disagree with your work so vigorously that they come for you, your job, your family, your life. Now, plenty of people write for the public, and in doing so, they risk their livelihoods every single time because institutions will rarely, if ever, protect any of us. As I often say, the job doesn't love us. It doesn't have the capacity to love us. We have to live our lives accordingly, and those of us without job protections have to take calculated risks when we want to share ideas beyond the purview of the page. Is that op-ed for which you were paid a pittance worth losing the job that sustains you and your family, however modestly? Probably not. But is that job worthy of your silence? Definitely not. There are just no reasonable choices for most of us who are writing from the margins. When we write for the public, we have to negotiate a series of unreasonable choices about what we say, for whom, and for how much. And then we have to anticipate the repercussions of these unreasonable choices. It's not that different from the work that we do in our classrooms as we try to teach writing to students and then encourage them to love it the way that we do and encourage our institutions to support our work in the ways we need. Once you've decided, I'm actually going to write for the public, there's the question of how and what to say. Now, most of us at least have some idea of what we want to say. The thing about writing is that so few of us are taught how to do it. What we do learn, we acquire by immersing ourselves in the work of others. We learn by example. And all too often, the models from which we are supposed to learn are not very good. We learn the ideas are generally sound, but how the ideas are communicated are often on much shakier ground. Look, a lot of writing is terrible. I don't say that in the way of low-hanging fruit that people love to grab for. It's just an honest assessment of how people offer up their ideas. Sometimes there's more passion involved than process, but it doesn't need to be that way. Most of us are, in fact, very passionate about our work, and all we need to do is figure out how to channel that passion into something that people are going to want to consume. I work in several different genres. I write cultural criticism, short and long fiction, narrative nonfiction, lyric essays, some comic books and graphic novels, memoirs, personal essays and opinion essays, and now screenplays. Only thing I've left behind is very bad poetry. And nobody believes me when I say I'm a bad poet, but I am. I once wrote a poem called Tears, and the first line was, I am crying tears. So take me at my word. But I realized very early on that it was better to diversify my approach to writing because writing is a muscle and you have to train it. And it's really good to train that muscle in a range of areas. So far, that has served me well. Now, as a fat black feminist with a lot of opinions, I endure not only criticism of my work, which is totally fine and welcome, but taunts, insults, and all manner of cruelty. I can generally tolerate all of that as the proverbial price of doing business, but like I said, I've had people call my job. I've had my people demand my firing from the New York Times, where incidentally, I'm not an employee, so good luck with that. And then, of course, there are the death threats and the other threats of violence. There are the people who learn my wife is Jewish and then threaten her and hurl racist and/or anti-Semitic epithets at us that are just chilling. I would like to believe that words can't harm, but they do. I would like to believe those threats are idle, but can I really take that chance? When I'm in the classroom, I'm teaching other people's children. When I'm at an event, I am sharing space with people who have communities and families who expect to see them alive again. When I'm at home with my family, my soft underbelly is exposed because I'm surrounded by everything I most care for. So I have to take those threats seriously. Sometimes I have security, armed men waiting in the wings, moving through the audience during an event. Their presence should comfort me, but mostly it reminds me that there's an element of danger to what I do when there absolutely should not be. Every single time I walk on stage, I hold my breath and I take that first step and then the next, and I wonder if today is the day that an angry man with a gun and a bullet will end my life because he doesn't like what I say, or how I say it, or how I look, or how I make him think and feel. Every time I publish something new, before I even send it to my editor, I'm doing the calculus of figuring out who my words are going to piss off and how much and what potentially they might do about it. I don't really consider quitting, but there are times when I think I should probably just write exclusively about the Real Housewives or stick to fiction or do anything that won't induce the anxiety of wondering if a given combination of words will lead to the worst day of my life. And so that brings me to the conversation portion, where I want us to talk about the kinds of things that we're afraid to write, why, and the kinds of risks that we are willing to take to stand up for what we believe in on the page. And so I'd love for everyone to take 5 minutes, even maybe even less, and just jot down, what are you most afraid to write and why? And then I would love for you guys to share some of what you've come up with. And as you come up with it, I would love to hear from some of you. So you feel free to unmute yourself and share what you're most afraid to write about, if you're comfortable, which is very antithetical, of course, to being afraid to write about it. Yes, you absolutely can go, Andrea.
Hey, Dr. Gay. Oh, thank you for being so wonderful today. I'm just getting into the office and just sitting down and getting ready to write. But I have a book that has been on my heart and in my mind, and I have struggled with it because it is as personal as it is academic.
Mm,
And I feel like I can't write the academic book without writing that personal one.
hmm
And so my idea was to interweave recipes inside of the sections. So the introduction has about a paragraph and a half, and then there's a line of the recipe. And throughout the entire chapter, there are lines of the recipe, and it's for epis. And at the
hmm
very end of it, I give the full recipe for epis. And what I
hmm
say is that the same way that this introduction is the grounding of the project, this recipe is the grounding of a dish.
hmm
But I'm really afraid um, that academics won't understand, that I will not be taken seriously as a scholar if I do this thing that is about my heart, and it's about women and divinity and food all at the same
hmm
time. So, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, unfortunately, that, and it speaks very poorly to academia that to take an innovative approach is somehow going to compromise the rigor of your intellectual work. And it would be very easy for me to say, oh, that fear is unfounded, but it's not. We see time and time again that we are supposed to write the way that the academy tells us to write. And when you look at a lot of academic writing, it's not great and it's
yeah,
not that engaging. And academics don't even like to read a lot of academic writing. And so when this is sort of tangential, but you should look at Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghosts by Crystal Wilkinson.
Yes, I have it on my list. Someone gave me just 2 days ago. She gave me three books that kind of do that, and that's
Mhm.
one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
there's another black chef. His name is Michael. He's black and Jewish, and I only mention that because it will help you find his book. He
Okay.
has two books, and they're tech Twitty. Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, Michael
Sharon.
Twitty.
Yes, does some interesting things in his work that blend. But one of the things that I will say to you is that write it anyway.
Okay.
Because do you really want the respect of people that wouldn't respect your work for that reason? Like, who's your audience?
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
like, ugh. But the other thing that you can do is write two versions. You write the academic version for academics and for your academic journals. Of course, it's more work, unfortunately, but this is the world that we live in. And then you write the more interesting version for the public.
Okay.
But it is it's a very challenging it's very challenging to do. But I also will say that academic writing, especially in the humanities, is slowly evolving, and that
Yes.
you can challenge some of the norms credibly, especially if you bring the necessary rigor to the more
Hmm.
academic portions of the work. And so
Hmm.
sometimes you just have to play the game better than the people who invented it.
Good.
I
I'm going
would,
to write that down. Play the game better than the people who invented it.
yes,
Okay. Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You are more than welcome. Tamara?
Hello. Um, I was really inspired by your words also. It was like very inspirational to me. And for me, what I had wrote was, well, I'm also because for Heinz for background, I like writing personally, but I usually write fictional stuff more like around the mystery genre.
Mhm,
And if I were to incorporate anything personal about me, it would be into the characters. So only like
mhm,
close friends would be able to point out, oh, that's her favorite color. Like, oh, that's her favorite food. And I see why she gave it to that character.
mhm,
But if for me personally, the most thing I'll be afraid to write about is like autobiographies or memoirs
mhm,
because my life has definitely it's been like an interesting roller coaster, but my biggest fear is to let people know more about me than what I usually allow them to know because
mhm,
I like discussing with my friends, about drama, gossip, things we've seen around campus, classes, even
mhm,
like our own self-growth and stuff like that. But the idea that like anyone can see a piece of me, especially the ones who I may be writing about, it's kind of worrying, especially the idea of them being able to read it and realize the kind of power they had over an aspect of my life and how that's traveled with me, even when I've moved on from even seeing them a part of my life. That's something that worries me. So it's like the idea that those same people who hurt me could seem like, oh, so she's still tripping about it. I'm gonna go hit
mhm.
up her Instagram right now and continue to use that power is something that's very worrying for me.
Yes, and that's an understandable worry. And one of the key things to remember is that this is where boundaries come in. And that once you establish boundaries for yourself as a writer and you maintain them, then you will know that whatever you put into the world, you're comfortable with people doing whatever with. Because the challenge when you're writing, especially if you're bringing anything in from the personal, is that you have no control over how it's going to be received.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as a control freak, I hate that. Like, what do you mean I don't get to control how people read my work and interpret it and
Literally.
understand it? That's trash. But when you're actually ready to write about something, you will have feelings about making yourself vulnerable because really what you're talking about is vulnerability and not being able to trust what people are going to do with that vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to decide when you're going to be safe, when you're going to feel confident enough to be vulnerable and know that maybe they're going to feel some kind of way and so on, but you get to block them on Instagram. Like you don't even have to engage with whatever reactions they're having to your work. Just block
Yeah.
them. And so you won't, you have to be ready. But the thing about being ready is that sometimes you're afraid and worried and you just do it anyway. Because when you simply sit around and wait to be ready, you might be waiting a very long time and you might be waiting forever. And if you can't tolerate the vulnerability. That's your system telling you, I'm not ready to write about this particular thing, and you have to take a different approach. But
Mhm.
sometimes what we're afraid of is just what will happen when I speak my truth, and how will these people respond? But who cares how they respond? They shouldn't have messed with you. Like,
Mhm. Exactly.
I mean, really, if you don't
Mm.
want me to write about the dirty shit you do, then don't be grimy to me. You know who I am.
That
So,
right there.
like,
Literally that right there.
you know who I am. So, that's a choice that you are welcome to make. And okay, like that's you. That's all you, baby. But I always have, and more seriously, I always have a set of guidelines for myself. And one of my other questions for you guys is, what is going to be your guiding principle as you write your way into the world? And that, what I mean by that is, what is the thing that you are never going to compromise on that will also, in part, define who you are as a writer? It's so
Mhm.
important to have that guiding principle and to have also a set of rules for yourself about how you write about yourself and the people in your life. Now, I actually have no problem writing about people who have done me harm, but I always try to remember that nobody is any one thing.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean that I need to be what I mean by that is we don't have to ever sort of unpack the psychology of people who have harmed us, but we do have to recognize that generally harmed people cause harm,
Yeah.
and that nobody is perfect. And we are not
Hmm.
perfect either, because oftentimes when we're writing about experiences, when we're writing about trauma, we tend to define ourselves solely as through victimhood. But
Hmm.
that's never the whole of our life experience, ever. We are so much more than that. And so, as I think about my own rules for how I write, I'm always trying to think of how can I make sure that I am bringing dimension to my work and to how I characterize not only myself but others. Because whenever
Hmm.
you write someone as a villain and they're just flat, and they are villainous and they've done villainous things, but what else are they? How do you give dimension and texture? Because life is complicated. And so just start thinking to yourself about what are your guiding principles going to be for your work, and having some of that work done for yourself. It's not even that you have to write it down, though it can help. It can really just help to provide guardrails for you as you think about what you want your work to be and how people are going to engage with it. And then the other question I have for everyone is, what kinds of risk are you going to be willing to tolerate in service of your work?
Mm.
And those can be risks that are both professional and personal. And as an academic, I've been forced to have those questions and those conversations with myself over the course of my more than 20-year career, because that's just the world that we live in. But it's important to know what you're going to be willing to risk and what you're not going to be willing to risk, because that can also help shape what it is that you want to write. Kayla.
Hi, this was to answer your first question.
Mm-hmm,
I had started writing like a autobiography in high school,
mm-hmm,
but I stopped, and I think it was more so me being like I wouldn't say afraid, but like me not being able to really accept all the things that I had went through, which
mm,
was really hard for me because it kind of really made me take a pause because it's like writing it, even though I know it can help somebody, when I had to really sit and reflect on all the things I went through, it hit different for me. Like it emotionally, like it really it put me in like a certain place like that I
mm,
didn't want to be in, which is kind of why I stopped writing about
mm-hmm.
myself. So I think the autobiography, it was really like that was kind of challenging for me. Like, so that's just what I wanted to say.
Absolutely. And Kayla, that happens a lot. And sometimes that's just your mind telling you something, that it's not time, that you're not ready. And that's okay. And when I've encountered that sort of resistance, I mean, that for me was a key indicator. Look, I need to go to therapy and I need to talk to someone. Now, therapy isn't for everyone, but I do recommend it for everyone if you can, if you have the means to avail yourself of it. But sometimes when you find that you are being triggered by your work, that it's just you're not ready, and that's okay because you might be ready some other time. Readiness is not fixed, it's fluid. And
Thank you.
yeah, you'll change. Kamari.
Is my mic on?
Now it is.
Okay. Good evening. Something that actually this is to answer the fear question. My
Mm-hmm.
family actually told me that they see me writing a autobiography about my life and about what I've gone through. And I found myself journaling and writing in a diary. And I think what kind of stopped me was I would get so caught up in my outside world that I wouldn't take time for myself and actually sit there and write about, the things that I go through. And I feel like reading back and looking back, like how she said, looking back at the things that I went through, it was kind of like, dang, do I want everybody to know this? And so what I did personally was I started reading books. Like I read I read different books, and like right now I'm reading a book. It's called The Let Them Theory, and that book is kind of helping me open my eyes to, just letting people think what they're going to think, do what they're going to do, and still, continue to be true to myself and to write and, let people hear my story, because that's kind of what I feel like my purpose was, to, share and inspire others. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just getting used to actually letting people understand and hear my story, because, it's really the judgment thing for me. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Um, and the judgment thing is hard, and I'm familiar with Let Them in Mel Robbins, and there are some flaws to it, but there's also the reason that book is doing so well and the idea is doing so well is because she's right, and she may not be the first or the only person to articulate that, but yeah, like let them, it's fine, just let them. You can't, and that's a lot of what I mean when I say you can never control how people are going to engage with your work when you put it into the world. You have no control. And so they're going to respond however they respond, and maybe they're being genuine in their response, but a lot of times, especially when people respond in ridiculous ways, they're being very disingenuous. They're just being very disingenuous. And so you have to take that with a grain of salt. And of course, it might hurt and it might sting, but at the end of the day, it says more about them than it ever could say about you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would also love to open it up to any questions that you have about writing or writing into the world. Yes, Olivia.
Hi, Dr. Gay. Thank you for your presentation today. I really enjoyed it. My question was, I really appreciated when you shared that writing is like a muscle that you need to
Hmm.
train in a range of areas. And I was wondering, what are some exercises that you would recommend in different areas to train that writing muscle? Maybe not poetry, since you steer clear of that, but in memoir, nonfiction, and fiction, what would you recommend as exercises?
Uh, you know, it it could be anything, but wait, so repeat the second half of your question.
Uh, I was, I specifically want to write memoir and fiction, so
Mhm.
that's the exercises I'm willing to train. But
Yeah.
for any in general, just how do you train that muscle?
Well, a lot of the time you train that muscle just by doing it and reading. I firmly and will always believe that reading is the most effective teacher you'll ever have. And one of the key things you can do is learn how to read like a writer. And Francine Prose wrote an amazing book several years ago, but it's, it holds up, called Reading Like a Writer. And what that book does is teach you how to read literally like a writer. Instead of reading for meaning and reading for analysis, you are reading for craft. And you are developing a craft language to better articulate why you write the way you do and what you're trying to accomplish with that writing. And so in this book, she talks about all of the not all, but many of the elements of craft and how to read a given work to understand the craft decisions that a writer has made. Another activity I really encourage people to do is something called craft annotations. It was a practice that was first developed by a writing teacher and writer named Peter Turchi, Turchi. And if you Google craft annotation Peter Turchi, lots of stuff will come up, including a handout that he has on his website that walks through the mechanics of a craft annotation. And that contributes again to the skill of reading like a writer. And then there are all kinds of writing exercise books, but for fiction, a book I love is called Naming the World by Brett Anthony Johnston. And in it, it has chapters across the craft spectrum that teaches various craft-based skills. And all of the chapters are from different writers, most of whom are very well known. And they offer not only some brief thoughts on the craft topic at hand, but of specific writing exercise. And in terms of writing for memoir, I don't have specific exercises that I recommend, but there are all kinds of uh, writing exercises that can be found online. And I'm trying to remember, there's a nonfiction magazine that has tons of it. I think it's Fourth Genre. And I don't know if they're still publishing, but they sometimes have craft related things that they put on their website, which I highly recommend.
Thank you so much.
Other questions?
I think our students would be interested in hearing this. Roxanne, you've described writing as hard work, even after all these years of writing, rather than effortless inspiration. What sort of sustains you through the challenging parts of this writing process? How do you keep yourself going?
Oh, I don't know. That's such a good question. It's, and I think about that a lot. Like, what is keeping me in it? But at the end of the day, the primary driving force is that I still love writing. I and I'm for me, writing is my best and most effective way of expressing myself. I am not necessarily going to be the most effective communicator like in a conversation. I can do it, of course, at this point in my life, but I prefer to be able to say it on the page where I feel like I have more control and I get to articulate my understanding of the world on my own terms. And so I love that. And another thing that sustains me, I don't write for an audience in any way, but I have found an audience nonetheless. And when I do events, which I do with alarming frequency, people are always sharing how they've engaged with my work. And it's not about empty flattery, it's that my work has genuinely reached people and helped them in ways I could have never anticipated. And that is really helpful to know that I didn't just write into the void, that my work has reached people, that the challenges of vulnerability, especially with like hunger, it sucked. Like when I asked myself the question, what am I most afraid to write? The thing was fatness. That was absolutely the thing I was most afraid to write about, even though it's also the thing that people perceive about me first alongside race. And so it was terrifying to write that book. It was even more terrifying to publish it. But when I started touring with the book and people started sharing their stories, and people from all kinds of different communities and people in all kinds of different bodies, like when skinny white women would come up to me and be like, "Oh my God, I felt like you were writing my own life." I would just be like, "Girl, what? Like, what are you even talking about?" And it made me realize I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder, but it also showed me that it's hard to live in a body and that everyone, regardless of their bodies, is dealing with very unreasonable societal expectations about how to live in that body and what that body should look like. And then my book started being taught in medical schools. And um, so now in many medical schools, rising doctors are learning that, hey, fat people are human. I'm actually teaching at Harvard next year, Harvard Medical School. And I'm going to be basically teaching doctors how to communicate. And not something I ever thought I would do, but like to know that my work has had that level of impact is awesome. And that definitely helps. But when you don't have that external validation, it is the internal validation of even if nobody reads this, I would do it anyway. And that's the kind of thing that motivates me. And then, of course, there are days when it's just like, you know what, I'm not feeling it. And then those days are okay too. We know, like, we don't talk about them enough. You're not a failure as a writer if you're dealing with writer's block. You're not a failure as a writer if you're too busy. And I also have the luxury of not having children. So, yeah, of course I can write all the time. It's just me and my wife and our dog. He is high maintenance, but it's okay. Like, we can manage this. And so it makes a lot of the other attendant parts of writing much easier when like, at the end of the day, I don't have to keep anyone alive except for this dog. And so I can feel however I want about my work today, and that helps. Jamil.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. And someone who really loves writing and thinks that writing is really central to my being as a human being, as a citizen, as everything else. I appreciate everything that you said. Resonates a lot with my experience as well. But I have a couple of questions with regards to your book, Writing into the Wound. Um, One, I just taught Ellison's Battle Royal. And
Mhm.
when I was reading the introduction to your book, I was wondering whether your disappearance trope is meant to be a rewrite of his invisibility narrative. Do you see it as primarily a form of psychic breaking or as a deliberate withdrawal from forms of visibility that were themselves coercive? And my other question, should I stop now and give you a chance to respond or ask them both?
I mean, no, I wasn't thinking of invisibility in that sense, but I
Okay.
definitely think the connection is there for sure. But it
Do you
wasn't
mind
intentional.
do you mind elaborating on it a little?
I mean, I don't know what more I can say other than that. I do see like why you would see that connection, but I was thinking about invisibility, but not in that sense. It was thinking about invisibility. I mean, oftentimes, and one of the things I read about quite a lot in Hunger is that even though you are highly visible when you're fat, you're also very invisible because people see right through you. They don't even acknowledge
Mhm.
you as human. They don't acknowledge you as there. And so, of course, when you think about Ralph Ellison and Invisible Man in particular, but um, his other works, a lot of what he was grappling with was also that same kind of invisibility for different reasons.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. The corporeality in your work.
Hmm.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you, like I see you even in your talk today, you're moving from kind of deeply personal trauma toward a broader social landscape marked by inequality, fascism, precarity, differential exposure to harm. I myself and other people talk about necrocapitalists and conditions that structures in which vulnerability is not shared equally, but distributed unevenly. I'm curious how you see the relationship between personal testimony and structural violence. Is writing into the one the way of building community through shared vulnerability, or is it a way of exposing the system that renders certain bodies more disposable than others?
It's more a way of exposing the system, though community does tend to arise from shared vulnerability, but it's along the lines of nonviolent protest. One of the key things that nonviolent protest shows is the brutality of the violence that is oftentimes wielded against people who are protesting nonviolently. It's not a passive form of protest. It's a protest that is meant to reveal all kinds of things. Um, and when you write in a vulnerable way in a world that takes advantage of vulnerability, you really do start to show the systems and how brutal they actually are. And so, yeah,
Okay, thank you so much.
thank you. Other questions that you guys might have?
You can also put your questions in the chat box if you like.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Gay. I've enjoyed your talk. I have a question regarding another dimension of vulnerability and
Mhm.
the vulnerability of a teacher who's a writer, a writing teacher.
Mm.
Um, there have been times when students submit essays that are confessional,
Hmm.
and sometimes they reveal things about themselves that um, you just could not have anticipated, such as sexual violence or um, a contemplation of suicide. And so, my question to you, and I guess I'm making an assumption, is um, when that occurs, what's the best approach to help the student further develop their voice while at the same time not crossing boundaries? Am I making sense?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's something I think about all the time because since I started teaching writing from composition all the way to now, when I teach at Rutgers and I teach fiction workshops and nonfiction writing workshops. And when you do that, students disclose everything. My God. And you can just tell it. Many of them have just been um, waiting for an opportunity. But I know I'm not a therapist. I know I do not have the training to handle trauma. So I have a range of responses. Primarily, I work with the students on the writing and I try to hold space for their truth. If it seems like it is emergent and acute, like that they're actually in crisis and not merely processing a past trauma, then I make sure that I talk to them about campus and community resources where they can go and get affordable and generally free help. Most campuses have very good, despite the university's best efforts, very good counseling centers where students can go. And so I always make sure I know what those resources are and I share them. And if it seems like someone is going to harm themselves, then of course I notify the university, but not necessarily formal channels, but I like look for the people that I know are going to treat the student with care and not bring sort of a carceral approach to what is a personal and mental health crisis. And that's been very rare. Most of the time, it's students disclosing things that happened a long time ago. Or I have found a lot of young women in relationships with really horrible young men. And in those instances, not afraid to boundary cross. I'm just like, girl, you need to break up with him. That boy is never, ever going to be okay if he is doing this at 19 years old. Just break up with him immediately. I'm very comfortable telling a student that because, and maybe I shouldn't be, but like when you see danger, you're just like, you need to run away from that young man. And you already know he's a problem because you're writing about him. And so I always tell them, do what you want, and I'm always here to talk to you. Like I'm here to listen if I can. But I'm very clear about what I will and won't listen to, and I try to be gentle about it. But I know that you can do a lot more harm than good when you try to like save your students. And the model for me was in high school, I wrote all kinds of stories about young girls being sexually assaulted. And of course, I was processing my own trauma. Um, and my teacher, Mr. McGuinn, was so great in that he worked with me on the writing, but he also walked me over to the counseling center. He knew that he was not equipped and that it was not appropriate for him to be sort of helping me process this trauma, but he took me to a place where maybe I could. And I don't know that I did at that time, but it certainly got me on the path to getting the help I would eventually need. And I remain grateful to this man that he did not try and sort of do anything creepy or weird. And so that's always like the question I ask myself if, as students bring this stuff to my classroom, and if I have to talk to them about it, I'm like, am I being creepy and weird or am I being helpful? And you just have to like be honest with yourself in those answers. I also think that gender plays a role, and I do think that male faculty members have to have a little bit more distance in many ways just because of the way the world is and that there's just because of the way the world is. And so I think Mr. McGuinn even 30 years ago understood that, or if I guess more than 30, Jesus Christ. um so just those are some thoughts. um do I get any pushback from my college about my liberal leaning. I sure don't. But I also am in a position to not care. And so, like I am fine working at Starbucks. My parents grew up with nothing. Like I know what poverty is. I have not experienced, but I know what it is. I've seen it. And that doesn't mean you know it, but like I know that I could survive anything. And I have been broke before, and I can be broke again. And because again, I don't have children, that does free me up. Like I don't want to lose my job, but I could, and I would be okay with that. But when I was at Purdue, for example, don't recommend. Um, I of course was a little less risk tolerant until I got tenure. And then once I got tenure, I was just like, let's go. And Rutgers is a really lovely institution, I have to say. There are lots of flaws at Rutgers, but um, the administration is very supportive. And I asked my colleague is Brittany Cooper, and Brittany Cooper also is a Black feminist doing very public facing work. And they have been incredibly supportive of our work and the things that we do. Um, and very supportive of the threats and making sure that campus police are aware. And for Dr. Cooper, in fact, oftentimes they have had to give her the necessary protection because, and I'm not sure why. Well, actually, I do have some thoughts as to why. She receives a level of threats that make mine seem like a fucking walk in the park, and they're not a walk in the park. I don't know how she does what she does. But I just am not afraid. But if I was teaching at like FAMU, I would probably feel some kind of way right now, or University of Florida, or University of Texas, or A&M. Um, there are many institutions right now where it is absolutely unsafe to do these kinds of things. And so I recognize that I have an immense amount of privilege in what I'm doing right now.
I think we have time for one last question. So this is Brion, who's one of our English majors. Why do you think the body positivity movement has seemingly lost so much steam in the past couple of years?
Um, that's a great question, Brian. White supremacy, is the answer. It is white supremacy and the policing of unruly bodies, of which oftentimes are women of color. And we see this with the MAGA aesthetic and the way so many people are trying to conform to that. We are seeing this with the rise of Ozempic and other GLP-1s, which, again, do what you want, man. Truly, it's your body. Don't listen to anyone else. Do what you want and what you feel like you need to do. But there is an increased and renewed societal pressure for thinness. And now we have this tool that some people are able to access. Um, and so now we have this demand, this pressure. Why won't you conform when we have given you a tool with which you can bring about that conformity? And I also think that the body positivity movement has lost a lot of steam because the most visible figures were people who should have been body positive all along. And what I mean by that is like it was a lot of really sort of thin women. Like I should hope you're feeling positive in that body. A lot of the people who were fat or super fat um, were body positive, but they weren't the most visible and the most celebrated. And so when those people, when the smaller sort of fat people and or thin body positive people decided that they could sort of Ozempic their way out of fatness, they gave up the ghost of promoting body positivity. And also people hate when women like themselves. And it's not only women, of course, that navigate body positivity, it's people across the gender spectrum, but it's primarily women that are the faces of these kinds of movements. And people always hate anything that empowers women or allows women to feel like they are fine and valid and deserve to be in the world. And so it's very easy for these movements to lose steam, but it's still there and it will continue to be there. And there will continue to be amazing people who fight for body positivity. And of course, we're also seeing the rise of body neutrality, where you don't have to feel positive or negative. You just have to be, and you're allowed to be however you choose to be in the world, or however your body chooses to be in the world, because sometimes we just don't have any control over it.
Yeah, I really hate to cut this this is fascinating, and I really hate to cut this short, but we are rather sort of densely packed together. The next panel starts at 12:45. But thank you so much again, Dr. Gay. This was delivered with your characteristic, humor and candor. It was so much fun listening to you.
Thank you.
And yeah, I know I'm going to carry a lot of this conversation with me to the classroom, and I'm sure it's going to stay with our audience as well. So thank you once again. Thank you to our virtual audience. Please remember to complete the survey, which is going to be emailed to you, at the close of the panel. And Marion, I would like to invite you to stay on for the next panel, which is at
Make sure you sign up for the
12:45.
next panel. Yeah, don't
Yes.
stay on here, but yeah, go sign up on the virtual program to go into the next room.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Gay. This has been
Thank you.
incredibly enjoyable today.
Thank you, Mary.